All right. Welcome back, everyone. All right. So today we're diving into experiential family counseling. And this is one of those theories that really shifts how we think about the therapist role. So instead of focusing primarily on techniques or structure, we're really, experiential approaches emphasize emotional presence, authenticity, and lived experience. And so, as we go through today's lecture, I want you to notice how much of this model is about who the therapist is and not just what the therapist does. So, what do you remember about humanistic and experiential theories from your theories class? So, before we get into specific models, let's just ground ourselves in the humanistic roots of experiential therapy. So, this perspective emphasizes the unique experiences of every individual and the belief that people have an inherent capacity to grow and heal. Like life is messy, and experiential therapists don't rush to clean it up or overstructure it. So, instead, they trust the natural movement towards growth when conditions are supportive. Does this sound familiar? Carl Rogers, that kind of thing? All right, so the foundational theorists for experiential family therapy are Virginia Satir and Carl Whitaker. So these are two names you absolutely need to know for experiential family therapy. And so while they had very different personalities and styles, they're considered foundational figures to this approach. So both Satir and Whitaker believe that emotional experience is the engine of change in families. So rather than focusing primarily on problem solving and insight or behavior modification, they emphasized emotional expression, authenticity, and growth within relationships. And so Virginia Satir, she brought a deeply humanistic and compassionate lens to family therapy. She focused on self-esteem, emotional validation, and communication. Communication is a huge one for her. And she believed that people are always doing the best that they can with the resources that they have. And her work emphasized warmth and connection, and the belief that families can heal with emotional safety. When that emotional safety is restored, that's when families can heal. And so Carl Whitaker, in contrast, he was known for his bold, confrontational, and often provocative style. He wrote that book, that I mentioned on the very first night of class, The Family Crucible. This is who wrote that. So he believed families become stuck in rigid emotional patterns and that therapy should disrupt or perturb the system to create movement. You'll hear that word perturb come up. So Whitaker used authenticity, humor, and emotional intensity to shake families out of their stuck roles and patterns. So, despite their differences, both theorists shared a core belief. Who the therapist is matters much more than what the therapist does. So, their work laid the foundation for experiential family therapy by centering emotional presence, genuineness, and the therapeutic relationship itself as the primary agents of change. So it also mentioned anti-theoretical, right? So experiential therapy is often described as an anti-theory. It doesn't mean that it lacks theory, it just means that it resists rigid manuals and formulas. And so some of you may really love this and some of you may hate it, right? But the therapist's intuition, presence, and authenticity are just as important as any intervention. And so, according to this approach, at least. So, in this model, being yourself isn't a mistake, it's part of the work. So what is experiential therapy? So what exactly does this mean? So at its core, this approach focuses on emotional process rather than the insight alone. The goal is not to analyze emotions from a distance, but to experience, right? It's in the name. Experience the emotions in real time within the therapy room. So the therapist's roles and core skills in experiential therapy, it's not neutral or detached. You're emotionally engaged and often transparent. So a key skill here is feeling reflection. You learn this in your basic skills class, reflecting feelings, reflecting emotional experience, not just facts. So therapists balance strong confrontation with warmth and support, which can feel bold, but it's always grounded in care. And also, immediacy and transparency are important in this approach. So, this means focusing on what is happening right here, right now, in the here and now. Think Fritz Perls, remember here and now Gestalt. So, if something has happened between family members or between the family and the therapist, it becomes part of the work. And experiential therapists are also transparent, meaning that clients often get to hear the therapist's assessment directly. And so I'll tell you, as an EFT therapist, we pull a lot from experiential. EFT is an experiential therapy. It's one of those postmodern, more newer ones, but it pulls a lot from this classic theory. Okay. So first, we'll look at Whitaker's symbolic experiential family counseling. And Whitaker, he was one of the most provocative figures in family therapy. He was known for his bold and emotionally intense style. Um, so he called it the therapy of the absurd, anti-theoretical, of course. It focused on the family's growth versus real, like resolving problems. Like Jay Haley, he was all about solving the problem, right? Jay Haley, and to some extent, Mnuchin was too. But Whitaker, he wanted the family's growth. And he also utilized a co-therapy model. And he talks about this in the Family Crucible, but they would do like their family therapy session, they would pause it, and then they would consult with each other and allow the family to hear that consultation. And that was, the intent was to help the family gain some insight and grow from that. And so he had these two kind of points, battle for structure and battle for initiation. The battle for structure is the counselor sets the tone, sets the structure. This is how we're going to engage. But the battle for initiation, Whitaker believed that you don't work harder than your clients. I'm sure you've heard that before. The client has to meet you halfway, right? Initiation. So some of his approaches, he would perturb the system. He believed that families got stuck in these rigid emotional patterns, and his goal in therapy was to perturb that system. So to shake things up just enough to create movement. And see, he often used like shocking statements to disrupt family dynamics and force new awareness. And so, like, when did you divorce your husband and marry your son? Right? If the boundaries were kind of getting off kilter, he would say something like that. Um, he would tell like couples, okay, when you start to argue, stop yourself, go to the bathroom. One of you sit in the tub, one of you sit on the toilet, and then you argue. And so that was supposed to be kind of an absurd, kind of perturbed, like this is out of the norm. We're still going to get to argue. I'm not saying you can't argue, but just kind of do it in an odd environment. And that's supposed to kind of shake things up, kind of bring it to the couple's awareness, something like that. And then those Gestalt techniques, which I mentioned a second ago, he would do empty chair, he would do exaggerations. Like if you do like a little hand movement, he would say, "Wait, what was that hand movement about? Then do that bigger and tell me what you're feeling." And um, so those were some of the techniques that Whitaker would use. Okay. So, let's see. He supported hierarchies similar to Mnuchin and Jay Haley. He was unconventional, but he did support the family structure, and he believed in supporting parental hierarchies, greeting the parents first, and having parents manage the children's behavior during sessions. And in healthy families, in his view, had clear boundaries yet flexible roles. And you'll see that come up in all of these approaches. Flexibility is a key component of health in a family. So there's this video. It's kind of long. It moves kind of slow because this is a bilingual family, or this is it has a translator. So he doesn't speak Spanish. The family speaks Spanish, but Carl Whitaker does not speak Spanish, and so it kind of moves slow. But it's interesting because it shows, and you can watch this on your own. I don't know that we'll watch this in class because it is so long. Um, so feel free to watch this on your own. The link is there in the slides. That's on Blackboard. But he gets down in the floor and he plays with the kid. He really makes a good rapport with the grandmother. It's a multi-generational home. It's just, I'll try to find a more succinct clip of his work for class, but this is just a good illustration. So I wanted to include this video here. All right, so now shifting into Satir's human growth model. And so when I learned about this in my master's program, I was like, yes, this is the kind of work I want to be doing. I just got really excited about it. So we're turning to Virginia Satir and her model. So she brought warmth, dignity, and deep compassion to experiential family therapy. Her approach feels different from Whitaker's, but it's grounded in similar values. So this is, if you're an undergrad psych major, you probably recognize this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and Satir's work is strongly influenced by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, particularly the idea that people cannot move towards growth and self-actualization unless their more basic needs are met first. So, Satir believed that emotional safety, validation, and belonging are foundational needs within families. And when those needs are unmet, when there's like chronic criticism, conflict, or lack of affection, family members will shift into survival modes rather than growth modes. So, in this sense, Satir viewed dysfunctional communication stances as adaptive survival responses. So, dysfunctional communication is not a personality flaw, according to Satir. It's the ways that people try to get their needs met when safety, love, or acceptance feels threatened. All right, so Satir emphasized that therapy must first create emotional safety and connection before expecting change. So once individuals feel seen, valued, and secure, they're more able to communicate congruently. And we'll talk about what that means here in a second, but they're able to communicate congruently, take responsibility for themselves, and move towards growth and self-actualization. So, from a Satir perspective, family therapy helps restore the conditions necessary for growth by addressing unmet needs for belonging, validation, and self-worth, and allowing families to move out of that survival and back into development. So this is kind of one of her. This is a it. She has a very self-focused approach to family therapy, more so than the other ones. The other ones were real systemic, real, the family as a whole. And she thought, if you can really improve yourself, if all of the family members can improve themselves, that the family unit would improve as a whole as well as a result. So this image represents Virginia Satir's self mandala, and it's a visual way to understand the many dimensions of the self that influence how a person functions in relationships and within families. Now, this may look familiar to you. I think I introduced it to you in that very first class, that intro class that we took together. I may have even had you color it. It looked like the wellness wheel. It's what it reminds me of. But this is from a family. This is from Satir's perspective. So at the center of the mandala, or mandala, however you want to say it, is the self, right? Which Satir believed is inherently worthy and oriented towards growth. So, surrounding the self are multiple interconnected dimensions of human experience. And Satir emphasized that none of these areas operate in isolation. So, when one area is distressed, it affects the whole person and by extension, the family system. So we'll just kind of take these bit by bit. I mean, they're kind of self-explanatory, but the emotional dimension includes feeling, self-compassion, the emotional expression, and just our ability to cry, laugh, experience joy, all that good stuff. But when emotional needs are unmet, people often shift into survival communication stances. So they might shut down, they might lash out, however that looks. So, the intellectual dimension involves thinking, learning, reflection, and meaning making, and families may over rely on this area to avoid emotional vulnerability. So, appearing like super reasonable, like a computer, right? Rather than emotionally presence, like facts, not feelings, right? But that avoids intimacy and connection, that intellectual start. So, some people might lean too heavily into this. It's an important part, but you don't want to over rely on it to avoid emotions. So next is the interactional dimension. It reflects relationships and connection, like socializing, intimacy, communication, and shared experiences. And this highlights Satir's belief that humans are wired for connection and belonging. And then there's the physical and nutritional dimensions. They represent care for the body, including movement, rest, food, and health, just overall health. Satir viewed physical well-being as foundational to emotional and relational health. When you don't feel good physically, it's hard to be your best self relationally and emotionally. So next is the sensory dimension. It includes touch, comfort, physical soothing, things like holding hands, massage, warmth, hugs, lovey-dovey affection. So this area connects strongly to early attachment experiences and feelings of safety. And then there's the spiritual dimension. It reflects meaning, purpose, values, connection to something larger than oneself. It's not necessarily religious, right? But Satir believed spirituality didn't have to be religious. It provided grounding and hope. That's what the spiritual dimension is about. And then, but if you're religious and that ties into your spirituality, that's okay too, right? It's not necessary. But finally, where I think we're at the last one, the contextual dimension, it includes daily responsibilities, routines, and the environment, like chores, work, and structure, just the day-to-day grind. But when life becomes overwhelmed by context alone, the emotional connection often suffers. And so you feel a lot of distance and coldness. We're going through the motions, but we're not feeling very close. So Satir used the self mandala to help clients and families recognize imbalances. So rather than labeling people as dysfunctional, she viewed symptoms as signals that one or more areas of the self needed attention, validation, support, things like that. And from a satir perspective, healthy functioning comes from balance across these dimensions, allowing individuals to communicate congruently and engage in relationships with authenticity rather than just survival. So that's the self mandala. So the core beliefs of Satir, one of her foundational beliefs was that everyone is doing the best they can with the knowledge and resources they have. And I tend to believe that. Sometimes it's hard to believe, but even when people are, being kind of jerks, but I tend to believe that everyone's just trying to, do the best they can with what they have going on, what they know. And so did Satir. So let's see. She believed everyone had the capacity to grow and heal, and everything impacts everyone else, and each person is responsible for themselves. So some of these concepts, from a satir perspective, problem family dynamics are less about bad behavior, and it's more about unmet emotional needs and disrupted connection. So Satir believed that families often become stuck in power struggles, particularly when individuals feel unseen, unheard, unsafe. The power struggles frequently stem from unresolved parental conflict, which children then adapt in order to survive emotionally. So, two core features of distressed families are a lack of validation and a lack of intimacy. When family members do not feel emotionally acknowledged or securely connected, communication obviously is going to become defensive rather than genuine. So, Satir believed that this process through what she called the survival triad, which is baby and two parents. Of course, that's a little antiquated, but this is, coming from Satir in the 50s and 60s. According to Satir, the quality of nurturing received in infancy played a critical role in shaping these communication stances. So, early life experiences of safety, affection, and responsiveness influence whether a person learns to communicate congruently or relies on survival strategies such as blaming and placating, like people pleasing, intellectualizing, or withdrawing, things like that. So, in this view, communication stances are not character flaws, once again, they are adaptive responses developed early in life to survive emotional stress within relationships. And so when I do my couples work, I meet with each partner individually and I ask them about their childhood and what their communication and emotional expression was like in their family. And it's very revealing. It usually how things were as a kid is kind of how things are as an adult. So it's kind of interesting in that way, how this pulls from that. So, all right. Communication stances. This is a big one for Satir. She believed early family experiences shape communication patterns, especially under stress. So, for the most part, sometimes you can kind of rock along with being able to communicate pretty functionally, but when you get under stress, that's when your worst comes out, right? And so, your tendency. So, kind of just think about your own tendency. We all kind of probably do some of these all at one point, but when you're stressed, what do you tend to want to do with that stress? So, she had identified several communication stances. As you see here, it's the blamer, pointing the finger at everyone else, not taking any responsibility. The placator, aka the people pleaser. And when you're people pleasing, you're not really allowing people to see you and know you and really be connected to you. So while you think you're pleasing everyone, a lot of times people, no one's pleased anyway. But when you're people pleasing, you're not being your authentic self. Then there's the super reasonable, like the computer. Um, and I know I'm kind of going out of order here to the visual here, but anyway, so the super reasonable, the computer is like a withdrawer, like facts, not feelings. Don't get so emotional, and then that creates coldness and disconnect. And then there's the irrelevant, that like the class clown. Let me just make a joke about this. I don't know. Let me change the subject, not take it too seriously, and that's just also to disconnect emotionally. But the main one to strive for here is congruent communication. And congruent communication means that your thoughts, feelings, words, your behaviors, all that lines up. What you experience on the inside is what you're communicating on the outside. And this is the healthiest stance. And the goal of Satir's work is to allow it, and that comes into attachment theory too, is that when you feel secure, you can say and do, you feel safe enough to say and do whatever's on your heart, on your mind. So that was the goal of Satir's work. So some of her techniques, some of her approaches, Satir was described as very loving yet forceful, and we'll watch a video in class of her work. But she was spontaneous, emotionally present, and deeply attuned to clients' experiences. And she did not allow endless complaining, but she instead focused on emotional responsibility and growth. Okay, so some more of her interventions. Satir used a variety of experiential interventions, including communication analysis. I think I have a slide here coming up about communication analysis, but really it's just about slowing down interactions and examining what's seen, what's heard, the meaning made, and the feelings involved, and the defenses used, and things like that. And I do that in my couples work too. Um, what else? So one of her, let's see, authentic self, you have to come in and be your the authentic self. If you can be authentic, then that allows safety for the clients to be authentic. Facilitating emotional expression between family members is important. That was one of her goals. Sculpting is a lot of fun, and we're going to do this in class with episode 4, and then we can do some other stuff too. We can sculpt your cohort if you want to. We can sculpt different shows that you watch. We can sculpt different, famous families. The Kardashians, I think we sculpted one year, whatever. But that's a lot of fun, and it really gives a visual of to what the family's experience is emotionally and relationally. And then the family temperature reading, that is just kind of that's a way for family members to check in with each other throughout the week. Like, how are we feeling? We feeling heated? We feeling cool? We feeling relaxed? And then the parts party, parts work. It's just interesting that parts work came from this. It also came from psychodrama. And then if you've heard of IFS, internal family systems, that's kind of a derivative of Satir's work. But that's just like acknowledging the different parts that you have. And I do a lot of this in my practice with individuals, especially people with anxiety. If we can kind of pull that out, or if they have a decision they're trying to make, the part of them that wants to stay, the part of them that wants to go, the part of them that wants to, and I'll have them actually sit in the chair and just be that part. And don't worry about all the other conflicting parts of you. Just be that part. Let's really flesh that out and let's understand that and hear that. And so that's kind of what Satir's Parts Party was about, is acknowledging the different conflicting parts of a person and letting those parts feel seen, heard, and understood. So there's a lot of other approaches that kind of pull from this, but this was sort of the original of that parts work. So if you want to know more about parts work, we can talk about it in class. I would love to share that with you, demonstrate it. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's really powerful too. Okay. Oh, communication analysis. And so this is another one that I do when I in my couples work, but it's slowing down. Okay, what was the trigger? What did you see in here that evoked this upset in you, right? What meaning do you make when you see and hear that? Maybe it's a tone, maybe it's a look on their face, maybe it's something they said. What do you meaning you make? It might be, well, they don't care about me or they're mad at me. What feelings do I have about the meaning I make? Well, if she's mad at me, then I feel bad. I feel shame. I feel sad, whatever it is. Or they might feel angry. Sometimes they go into those secondary emotions. And then what feelings do I have about these feelings? Maybe I feel angry about having these feelings. Like, why is she mad at me? Now I feel sad and that pisses me off, right? And then what defenses do I use? Do I walk away? Do I shut down? Do I stonewall? Maybe I lash out. Maybe I criticize. Maybe if I could just explain to them what they're doing, they would do something different and not be mad at me, right? Over explaining. Whatever the defenses are, that's that part of the analysis. And then what rules for commenting do I use? How do I approach my significant other or my family member about this experience that I'm having? Am I even allowed to talk to them about it, right? So that's communication analysis. And EFT definitely pulled from that. All right, so here is the video that we'll watch in class together. But the interventions you'll see is that she'll help facilitate communication. This is old, right? It's like 70s, early 80s. But she uses touch and it really cringes everyone out. Students usually, and me too, but it works effectively. Like, she can do this because she's like a grandmother. I would say just limit your use of touch, just as a good rule of thumb. I think that's what you're taught. I think that's good to be taught. But anyway, Virginia Satir, she used touch, and we'll see that in her video. And then sculpting and role play. And then we'll actually get to try some of this out in class as well. So All right. So as you watch episode 4 of This Is Us, I want you to pay attention to emotional expression, communication stances, and unmet emotional needs across generations. So I want you to notice who's placating, who's blaming, who's avoiding, all those things, and where is the congruence missing, and is anybody congruent? And then we'll also sculpt this episode in class. So pay attention to what happens at the pool and then the similarities to present day dynamics. But we usually like to kind of role play what happens, what goes down at the pool, and then just go from there. All right. So, to wrap up, experiential family therapy reminds us that who the therapist is matters just as much as what the therapist does, and your presence, authenticity, and willingness to engage emotionally are central to this work. So, be sure to read chapter 4 in your Murdoch text and watch This Is Us episode 4 before our next class. And I look forward to discussing this with you and doing some activities in class. So, thanks for listening.